Hey everyone, I'm Nico from Licks of the Beast, and this is episode 1 of a two-part series where we're going to talk about the Blaze Bayley era of Iron Maiden. Stick around. This is a topic I wanted to cover a little further down the line, but with this year marking the 25th anniversary of the album Virtual 11 and Blaze's recent medical emergency and thankfully successful surgery, I figured this would be an appropriate time, and hopefully these two videos will help send some positive vibes his way as he goes through his recovery. This series won't feature a whole lot of guitar playing, and it won't be a song-by-song breakdown, but more of an overview of both albums. The reason for this is simply that I mostly want to talk about the band's musical direction during that time period, but we will look at a few key musical examples as we go along. Before we get into the music of the X Factor, I think it's important to examine the context in which the album was written and recorded. In the mid-1990s, grunge was at its apex, and it wouldn't be long before alternative rock would begin to make its presence felt in a big way. Bands like Matchbox 20, Garbage, Collective Soul, and Live. Some bands like Smashing Pumpkins, Hole, and a new band called Foo Fighters were crossing over into what some would refer to as post-grunge. Pop-punk also started to become mainstream with the success of bands like Millencolin, Pennywise, Goldfinger, Sum 41, Green Day, The Offspring, and of course, Blink-182. In the middle of all this, classic metal had become a played-out genre for a number of reasons that we won't get into in this video. But simply put, people grew tired of the excessive amount of copycat bands and the standard metal tropes and cliches. Funny enough, the nostalgia of those very same tropes and cliches is in a big way responsible for the current resurgence of classic metal. Rock radio stations and TV music stations like MTV had pretty much stopped playing any kind of classic heavy metal, and local unsigned bands everywhere had to change their musical direction if they wanted to get any kind of gigs, let alone a shot at having some A&R rep listen to their demo. Even I was listening to less and less heavy metal, and the heavier bands that I was really into at the time were more along the lines of Alice in Chains, Danzig, Typo Negative, and my absolute favorite band of the 90s, White Zombie. My band went from playing metal covers and especially originals to a more post-grunge style, and the rule was no Maiden, no Priest. Meaning if we were working on a song and I came up with a pedal point riff like someone would say, no Priest. Or, yeah, and then the dragon rises from behind the drums. No. This is the background in which former metal giants like Metallica, Scorpions, Ozzy Osbourne, Dio, Judas Priest, and Iron Maiden had to try to keep making music that would please their longtime fans and still sell enough records to keep the labels, management, and other stakeholders happy. And if it sounds like an impossible task, it was. With Bruce out of Iron Maiden, the band was faced with the immense task of finding a replacement. People were hoping for Halloween's Michael Kiske or any other young tenor who could bring back that same energy and power for which Bruce was so famous. Of course, Bruce was not just a powerful voice, but also a charismatic frontman, an excellent songwriter, and someone who had a strong influence on the band's musical and creative direction. So the only logical thing to do was to not try to replace him, but to find someone whose voice, presence, and personality were distinctly different and more in line with the times. To that end, Blaze Bayley actually seemed to be an excellent candidate. I remember being very excited about the possibilities for the next album because I liked his work with Wolfsbane quite a bit. Blaze had a cool swagger to his singing, and his tone, phrasing, and delivery reminded me of a more metal David Lee Roth. As with other Maiden albums before, I went out to buy the X Factor on release day, and my first impression of the cover was that they had really gone for a dark look with imagery that was a little less cartoonish and more like a graphic novel. For a band at that point in their career, a revamping of the image can either be a new beginning or the beginning of the end. In Iron Maiden's case, it looked serious and well thought out enough to suggest the former, and that was very exciting. When I got home, I put the album on and sat with sleeve in hand, pressed play, and pretty much held my breath as I waited for Sign of the Cross to start. The dark and brooding intro with the Gregorian chants and eerie melody was something they'd never done before on an opening track. Their openers were traditionally upbeat, fast-paced songs to get the adrenaline pumping. This was an entirely different thing. The build from the intro is gradual, but then the verse comes in completely out of nowhere with no riff, melody, or guitar harmony preceding it. This is actually really cool because it introduces Blaze in a very impactful way, and I think he absolutely nails this song. His delivery is powerful, and you get a sense that Steve's lyrics resonated with him because he's really embodying his character. You can feel it on lines like, "Why then is God still protecting me even when I don't deserve it?" and "Inside the head, feel the fear start to rise." The way he delivers those lines on the record is just huge. This song is their first ever to have such a long, stretched out intro. It's just short of 3 minutes. And this is one of the reasons I think of this album and the one that came after as transitional albums in the band's career. This is really where the band's sound and songwriting started to mutate in a big way, leading to what would become the band's sound in the 2000s, starting with Brave New World. My only gripe with this song is that they recorded it just a little bit too slow, same as with Flight of Icarus, and it probably should have been played in the key of D minor instead of E minor, as it would have suited Blaze's range a little bit better. In fact, he plays it in D in his own solo performances. Lord of the Flies and Man on the Edge were both pretty strong singles, and both were co-written by guitarist Janick Gers, who was continuing to establish himself as a strong songwriter in the band after having co-written 5 of the previous album's 12 songs. Both these songs feature a very different kind of vocal melody from the band's previous work with Bruce Dickinson, as it really seems like they tried to showcase Blaze's focused and intense mid-rangey singing style. The choruses are strong and both feature some fantastic guitar work by both Dave and Janick. Let's just take a quick look at the main riffs of both these songs. Here's the one from Lord of the Flies with that cool pizzicato style, which is very unique for Maiden. Janick would eventually repurpose this riff for Gates of Tomorrow almost 10 years later. And the main riff from Man on the Edge almost has a Motorhead kind of vibe to it. In Lord of the Flies, Janick takes a short and simple solo that fits the song perfectly and is followed by a great sing-along melody that worked really well live. In Man on the Edge, the middle section is frantic and relentless, like an even more intense Back in the Village, and that's followed by 2 blistering yet very hooky solos by Janick and Dave respectively. Perhaps the song is a bit too similar to the previous album's first single, Be Quick or Be Dead, but it's a good song with great riffs, a great chorus, and a very strong delivery by Blaze. I also really like the sound of Steve Harris's bass on this one. It's quite mid-heavy, and that gives it a nice punch and makes his quick fills really stand out. Fortunes of War is another song with a long, brooding intro with a few false starts before it really gets going. This is a dark piece that really tackles the reality of PTSD and war-related stress in a haunting way. Dave Murray plays this beautiful melody that is one of my absolute favorite moments of the album. At the 4 minutes and 38 second mark, the song changes drastically from a grind to a fast gallop out of nowhere with no build or transition. They did the opposite on Genghis Khan back in 1981, and it worked really well on that track. But here, it seems like there's a piece of the song missing because it feels a little bit too drastic. The gallop section sounds like classic Maiden, but it also doesn't. And that's because it's a slightly busier chord progression and the melody has shorter notes than their more typical melodic lines. It's a little bit more like Deja Vu, although the lack of harmonies make it feel a little more dry and less majestic. And that is really very much in line with the song's bleak outlook. Even when the vocal doubles the guitar melody, there is a coldness and lifelessness which is much different from when they did something similar on Heaven Can Wait. Perhaps with a slightly slower tempo and some gang vocals, or at least a few more layers, it would have sounded bigger and more lively. But again, this is in line with the lyrics and it really reflects the spirit of the times. The 90s were very much about exploring darker themes head-on without dressing them up or trying to make them more palatable. The transition back to the chorus is smoother this time around thanks to Nickel's drum fill, which helps slow things down a little more organically. And I kind of understand why the first change was so drastic, because doing the same thing twice would have sounded redundant and a longer build-up would have been too obvious. So it was probably easier to have one of the two changes be a little drastic. Look for the Truth has a really intense and atmospheric intro, but once the full band comes in, I find it doesn't really carry a lot of momentum and it doesn't quite go anywhere. Still, I think it's a good enough song that if one finds meaning in the lyrics, it can still work for them. And I have to say the guitar solos are really great. Janick plays a short but very neat slide solo, and Dave's cool phrasing reminds me a bit of Rush's Alex Lifeson. The Aftermath is another interesting song that deals with the consequences of war and asks whether it's worthwhile considering the resulting atrocities. So again, the band is tackling a somber and serious topic in a very straightforward and direct manner. This one also has a very different pace and groove from anything they've done on any of their previous albums. It's almost like a dark and grinding take on an AC/DC riff. Blaze's vocals here are very solid with a really full tone and thick vibrato that is almost too much on the choruses, but it's still just right. It's a powerful delivery. Janick plays an absolute scorcher of a solo. The fast licks are not just fast, but they're passionately fast. It's the kind of fast solo that makes you feel something in your stomach. And the way he hits some of the longer notes sounds like actual wailing. Absolute killer work by Janick on this one. Judgment of Heaven is a weird song for me, because on the one hand, I think it's a good song with a strong chorus and a fantastic middle section. It's also a rather interesting song with self-reflective lyrics, which is something I always enjoy, and it shows Steve really went for something different with the melodies. But I always found the first verse very difficult to listen to. I can't tell exactly what it is, but I've always found that melody needed to be worked out a little better. I also don't think they were able to get the right performance out of Blaze for this one. His voice suits the song well, but the melodies feel kind of jagged in some spots, especially that first verse. I think that a slightly softer attack and a bit of glissando between the notes would have gone a long way to making it sound smoother. I get the feeling that Blaze likes this song a whole lot, as he's been playing it live for years, and he really seems to draw great personal meaning from the lyrics when he sings it. And this is another one he plays in the key of D, so perhaps it's another case in which dropping the key down a step might have accommodated his voice a little better, resulting in a smoother performance. The Edge of Darkness is probably my personal favorite song on the album. It's got a great theme, it's based on the very powerful movie Apocalypse Now, a very cool riff in the style of The Trooper, the classic Maiden gallop, a brilliant vocal melody, and an incredible performance by Blaze. This is exactly what I hoped Maiden would have sounded like when I found out he was going to be their new singer. Every note is delivered with power and intensity, and the long notes are strong and confident. It's even got a nice guitar harmony after the solos. It's basically the one that most harkens back to classic Maiden, and the one where Blaze shines the most. Fantastic song. 2 AM is probably one of the most bleak and depressing songs the band has ever written, but songs like that can be cathartic sometimes. Musically, it's a pretty cool song, and Blaze's singing on this one, a lot like Edge of Darkness, was exactly what I was hoping he'd deliver. The standout tracks on this album, for me, are Blood on the World's Hands and The Unbeliever. I think those are the two songs where they really nailed the sound they seem to have been going for on the record. They're original, creative, intense, and they don't follow many of the classic Iron Maiden patterns, although it still sounds very much like Iron Maiden. I did a full song breakdown video about Blood on the World's Hands, which I will link to the video description as well as the end screen. And in that video, I referred to the song as being arguably their most underrated. And I absolutely still believe that, and actually, The Unbeliever would have been my next choice. The vocal melodies also suit Blaze's voice and singing style perfectly, although, whereas on Blood on the World's Hands he sounds in perfect control, The Unbeliever is yet another song where he seems to be reaching the very limits of his comfort zone in some of the higher spots. He sounds terrific on the verses, but his voice loses some of that power on the choruses, and that's not by any fault of his own. Every singer has their range, and a band sounds best when they work to create the best possible canvas for the singer's voice to shine so that they can deliver the song's message to the best of their potential with emotion and confidence. Once again, tuning down a whole step to D would have made this already great song sound so much more powerful. I want to address a few quick points that I feel are absolutely crucial to keep in mind when discussing this album. Because it's easy to forget that a band like Iron Maiden is a very unique entity in rock music. They haven't taken any breaks, nor have they ever gone on any kind of indefinite hiatus. The band's timeline is a very continuous thing right from their earliest beginnings in December of 1975, so each album represents a moment in time for them, and it is therefore impossible to ever separate the music from where the band was at creatively, emotionally, and mentally. The opinions I expressed in this video are from the point of view of a fan who has studied and enjoyed the band's music for 4 decades, and in so doing has gained a fair amount of insight into the band's logic and their way of doing things. And I want to stress that any critique that I can give today in hindsight is only for the purpose of learning how a band manages to get through adversity and course correct over time. There are also some good lessons to be learned from some of their less than ideal decisions, especially for those of you who are actively in bands, perhaps with the hopes of one day taking that to the next level. You know, it's a little unfortunate that the production of the record turned out to be a little too flat and dull, because with a more lively sound and a more in-your-face mix with louder, fuller, and brighter guitars, the heaviness of the songs would have come across a whole lot better. Especially because there are some seriously strong tracks, and the band's performances were really good throughout. Overall, The X Factor is a solid Iron Maiden album with some hits and some misses, but the misses are not because of a lack of inspiration or a lack of creativity. They were merely part of the growing pains the band had to go through in order to get to the awesomeness of Brave New World just a few years later. And it's important to acknowledge that Blaze Bayley was instrumental in this process, as he has 5 writing credits on this album and 3 more on the next one. He also had the impossible task of getting them through a very bumpy 5 years, and without having been given an ideal platform for his powerful voice to truly shine to its fullest potential. By this I mean the band should probably have tuned down for some songs, as I mentioned earlier in the video. The vocal melodies could have been adapted a little more to better suit Blaze's singing style, and for their live performances, they could have tuned down a step, or even a half step at least, especially for those songs that are clearly not within Blaze's ideal range and comfort zone. The truth is, the 90s were really not kind to most of the rock and metal legends of the previous decade. With the loss of 2 key elements, first Adrian and then Bruce, between 1989 and 1993, Iron Maiden found themselves in a very difficult position without the luxury of being able to stop and take some time to make the best possible adjustments. Realistically, no band was going to get it 100% right under those circumstances. But Iron Maiden started from a difficult situation and began developing a new sound that would, within just 5 years, see them reunited with Bruce and Adrian and launch them to even greater heights than ever before, and ensure the band's longevity beyond their wildest dreams and ours. I want to take this opportunity to wish Blaze a full and speedy recovery. I was really glad to read that his surgery went well and that he will get back to making music and performing for his fans before too long. It would be awesome if we could all use this space to send Blaze some good vibes, and I'd love to hear what is everyone's favorite moment from the X Factor. I hope you enjoyed this video, and we'll discuss the follow-up album, Virtual 11, on the next one. Thank you all so much for watching, and stay tuned for more licks of the Beast.